Some mistakes don't just earn you a detention. They wake up a sleeping giant. When a privileged high school senior thought it was hilarious to humiliate an old man and vandalize his prized motorcycle, he forgot one crucial rule. You never know who that quiet man considers family. Arthur Pendleton was not a man who demanded attention. At 74 years old, he had earned the right to live quietly. A decorated veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division, Arthur returned home in 1969 with a handful of medals, a slight limp, and a desperate need for the open road. With his back pay, he bought a brand new 1969 Harley-Davidson FLH Electrolyte. For over 5 decades, that motorcycle was his therapist, his companion, and his only true constant. Arthur lived in Bakersfield, California, a town that balanced agricultural grit with spreading suburban sprawl. He lived a life of rigid, comforting routine. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 10 a.m., Arthur would kickstart the shovelhead engine, its iconic thumping potato rhythm echoing down his street, and ride to Cal's Route 58 diner. He would sit in the corner booth, order black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, and read the local paper. He bothered no one, and in return he expected the same courtesy. But courtesy is a foreign concept to those who have never had to earn it. Enter Brandon Decker, 17 years old, captain of the high school lacrosse team, and the son of Richard Decker, one of the wealthiest real estate developers in Kern County. Brandon had lived his entire life shielded by his father's checkbook. He drove a pristine, aggressively lifted 2022 Ford Raptor, a $70,000 truck bought for him simply for getting a C-plus average in his junior year. Brandon was arrogant, loud, and constantly performing for the approval of his equally entitled friends, Tyler and Mason. It was a brisk Tuesday morning in late October. A heavy rainstorm had swept through the valley the night before, leaving deep, oily puddles in the unpaved overflow lot next to Cal's diner. Arthur had just finished his breakfast and walked out to the parking lot. He pulled a microfiber cloth from his worn leather jacket and began meticulously wiping down the chrome on his Harley, carefully removing the light morning condensation. Brandon and his friends had skipped their second-period history class to grab milkshakes. They were lounging against the oversized tires of the Raptor when Arthur walked out. To Brandon, Arthur wasn't a human being. He was a prop, an easy target for a cheap laugh. "Check out this fossil," Brandon sneered, loud enough for Tyler and Mason to hear. "Think that piece of junk even starts? Or does he just pedal it?" Tyler chuckled, pulling out his phone and opening his camera app. "Go ask him, bro. Let's get a video." Brandon's ego couldn't resist the lens. He climbed into the driver's seat of the Raptor and fired up the engine, aggressively revving the massive V6. He threw the truck into drive and slammed his foot on the gas, tearing across the asphalt towards the dirt overflow lot where Arthur was parked. Arthur looked up, his weathered eyes narrowing beneath his gray newsboy cap, but he didn't flinch. He expected the truck to pass by. Instead, Brandon cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, intentionally drifting the massive truck through the deepest, muddiest crater in the lot, mere feet from Arthur and the Harley. The tires spun violently, acting like a buzzsaw in a swamp. A massive wave of thick, gravel-filled, oily mud erupted from the wheels. It slammed into Arthur like a physical blow, knocking him a step backward. The foul-smelling sludge coated the left side of his body, dripping down his leather jacket, smearing across his face, and utterly burying the gleaming chrome of the '69 Electrolyte in a thick layer of filth. Brandon slammed the brakes, rolling the window down. He leaned out, a cruel, mocking grin plastered across his face. "Oops. Sorry, Grandpa," Brandon yelled over the engine. "Looks like you needed a wash anyway. Tell you what, my dad pays guys to clean our pool. I'll send you a coupon." His friends howled with laughter from the passenger seats. But Brandon wasn't finished. Emboldened by the audience, he grabbed his half-empty, oversized iced coffee from the cup holder. With a lazy flick of his wrist, he hurled the heavy plastic cup directly at the motorcycle. It smashed violently against the Harley's vintage gas tank, leaving a noticeable dent and splashing sticky caramel syrup over the mud-caked engine fins. Arthur stood perfectly still. The cold, wet mud seeped through his jeans. He slowly reached up and wiped the grit from his eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. He just looked directly at Brandon. It was a cold, hollow stare, The kind of look a man develops when he has seen the absolute worst of humanity in a jungle 50 years ago. The silence unnerved Brandon for a fraction of a second. To break this sudden tension, he flipped Arthur the bird, fed the gas, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving a trail of black smoke and flying gravel in his wake. Sarah, a waitress who had worked at Cal's for 10 years, rushed out the front door with a stack of wet towels. "Oh my God, Arthur, are you okay? I'm calling the police. I know who that kid is. That's the Decker boy. He's a nightmare." Arthur gently took a towel from her hands. His voice was calm, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Sarah shiver. "No police, Sarah," Arthur said, slowly wiping the sticky syrup off the Harley's leather saddle. "The law handles crimes. This wasn't a crime." He paused, looking at the fresh dent in the custom-painted gas tank. This was an insult. Arthur limped his muddy, sputtering Harley back to his small garage on the outskirts of town. He didn't go inside his house to shower. He simply pulled up a rolling metal stool, grabbed his bucket of cleaning supplies, and went to work on the bike. He worked in absolute silence, his jaw set, carefully scrubbing the grit out of the fragile, cooling fins of the shovelhead engine block. Every scrape of gravel against chrome felt like a physical sting. 2 hours later, the deep, guttural roar of a modern Milwaukee 8V twin engine rattled the loose, corrugated metal of Arthur's garage roof. A shadow filled the doorway. It was Iron Mike Gallagher. Mike was 55 years old, stood 6 feet 3 inches, and possessed the build of a heavyweight boxer. Across the back of his heavily worn leather cut was the unmistakable Death's Head logo. Above it, the top rocker read Hell's Angels, and below it, the bottom rocker proudly displayed California. Mike was the president of the local Bakersfield charter. To the local police, Mike was a man to be watched carefully. To Arthur Pendleton, Mike was family. Back in the late 1980s, before Mike was a patch-holding president, he was a reckless prospect who had nearly gotten himself killed when his front brake line snapped on the highway. Arthur, who used to run the best independent motorcycle repair shop in the county, had not only fixed the bike for free, but had spent months teaching a young, hot-headed Mike the mechanics of patience, both in engines and in life. Arthur became the unofficial, fiercely protected civilian mechanic for the chapter. He attended their weddings, and he had stood quietly in the back at their funerals. "Morning, Artie," Mike boomed, walking into the garage. He carried a 6-pack of pale ale, setting it on the workbench. "Thought I'd swing by, see if you wanted to look at that clutch slip I was telling you about." Mike stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locked onto the Harley. Even though Arthur had cleaned most of it, the deep scratches in the chrome exhaust were glaringly obvious. Then Mike saw the dent in the gas tank. Finally, he looked at Arthur. The old man was still wearing his mud-stained jeans and boots. A streak of dried dirt was caked into his gray beard. The atmosphere in the garage dropped 10 degrees. "What happened?" Mike asked. His voice was no longer friendly. It was a low, dangerous rumble. "Nothing you need to worry about, Michael," Arthur replied without looking up, polishing the primary cover. "Truck passed me too close on the shoulder. Splashed a puddle. The dent, I dropped a wrench." Mike walked over and dragged a thick finger across the dented tank. He picked up the plastic lid of the iced coffee cup that was still wedged near the engine block. He smelled it. "Caramel," Mike said softly. "You drink your coffee black, Artie. Have for 40 years. Arthur sighed, putting his rag down. "Let it go, Mike. It's just some dumb kid." Mike didn't argue. He didn't press Arthur for the story. He simply nodded, patted the old man on the shoulder, and walked out to his bike. But Mike didn't ride back to the clubhouse. He rode straight to Cal's Route 58 diner. When Mike walked into the diner, the low murmur of conversation instantly died out. The waitresses knew him. He walked straight up to the counter where Sarah was wiping down the register. "Sarah," Mike said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Who disrespected Artie?" Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the towering biker. But her anger over what had happened to Arthur won out. She leaned over the counter. It was Brandon Decker, Richard Decker's kid. He drives a white Ford Raptor, lifted, with black rims. He practically ran Arthur over, threw mud all over him, threw his drink at the bike, and laughed in his face. Tyler Jenkins was with him. Filmed the whole thing on his phone. Mike's eyes narrowed. "Appreciate it, Sarah." 30 minutes later, Mike kicked the heavy oak door of the Hells Angels clubhouse shut. The room was dark, smelling of stale beer, leather, and cigarette smoke. Around the massive wooden table sat 8 fully patched members of the Bakersfield Charter, including the Sergeant-at-Arms, a massive, heavily tattooed man named Bones, and the Vice President, a tactical thinker named Slider. "We got club business?" Slider asked, noting the dark look on Mike's face. "We got family business," Mike said. He leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the scarred wood. "You boys remember how Artie rebuilt my transmission back in '98? You remember how he sat in the hospital waiting room for 3 days straight when Bones got clipped by that semi?" A chorus of solemn nods went around the table. Everyone respected Arthur. To the club, the old man was an untouchable saint. Some rich high school punk named Brandon Decker just used Artie for target practice, Mike growled. He relayed the story exactly as Sarah had told it. He described the mud. He described the dented tank. He described the laughter. By the time Mike finished, Bones had already stood up, his knuckles white as he gripped his pool cue. "Give me an address. I'll go break the kid's legs right now. I'll pull the engine out of that Raptor with my bare hands." "Sit down, Bones," Mike snapped. "We aren't breaking his legs. The kid is 17. We put a hand on him. The cops bring down the hammer, and Artie gets dragged into a media circus. Artie doesn't want violence. He wants peace. So we do nothing?" Slider asked, frowning. Thursday morning arrived. The sky over Bakersfield was a crisp, clear blue. At Bakersfield West High School, the morning bell was exactly 20 minutes away from ringing. Brandon Decker pulled his white Ford Raptor into the senior parking lot, taking up 2 spaces right near the front entrance, just as he always did. He hopped out, wearing a designer varsity jacket, flipping his keys in the air. Tyler and Mason were already there, laughing about the video of Arthur that they had posted to a private group chat the night before. "Man, you should have seen the old guy's face," Brandon laughed, leaning against the grill of his truck. Looked like he was going to cry. Probably spent all night washing his toy. "You're savage, bro," Tyler chuckled, high-fiving him. Brandon stopped laughing. He turned toward the main intersection leading to the high school. Coming over the crest of the hill, completely blocking all 4 lanes of traffic, was a massive wall of black leather and chrome. Leading the pack was Iron Mike Gallagher, riding a custom murdered-out road glide. Behind him, riding in perfect military-style 2x2 formation, were the Hells Angels. It wasn't just the Bakersfield chapter. There were patches from Fresno, Vallejo, San Bernardino, and beyond. There were easily 200 heavily patched outlaw bikers, their engines roaring in a synchronized mechanical symphony that shook the windows of the high school cafeteria, and they were turning directly into the Bakersfield West High School parking lot. The sheer volume of the noise was paralyzing. 200 heavy cruiser motorcycles poured into the student parking lot like a mechanized cavalry, moving with terrifying precision. They didn't speed, and they didn't rev their engines aggressively at the students. Their intimidation lay entirely in their absolute, unwavering order. Brandon Decker froze, his designer coffee slipping from his fingers and splattering against the asphalt. Beside him, Tyler and Mason abruptly stopped laughing. In a matter of seconds, the bravado of a wealthy 17-year-old was entirely dismantled by the sight of 200 hardened outlaws surrounding him. The bikers fanned out. They didn't park in the designated spots. Instead, they formed a massive, impenetrable steel perimeter around Brandon's white Ford Raptor. They parked their bikes wheel to heel, effectively trapping the oversized truck in a cage of chrome and exhaust. When the last bike shifted into neutral, Mike raised his right fist. In perfect unison, 200 kill switches were hit. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sounds left in the morning air were the ticking of cooling exhaust pipes and the frantic, panicked whispers of the student body. The school resource officer, Deputy Evans, had his radio pressed to his mouth, frantically calling for backup, completely out of his depth. Iron Mike Gallagher slowly swung his heavy boots off his road glide. He didn't rush. He took off his leather riding gloves, tucked them into his belt, and walked deliberately toward the Ford Raptor. Behind him, Bones, Slider, and a dozen other heavily patched members fell into step, forming a wedge of muscle and leather. Tyler and Mason didn't even pretend to be loyal. The moment Mike locked eyes with them, they scrambled backward, abandoning Brandon and disappearing into the crowd of terrified teenagers. Brandon was left standing completely alone against the grill of his truck. His face had drained of all color. His knees visibly shook. "Morning, Brandon," Mike said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried perfectly in the tense silence. I think you have the wrong guy," Brandon stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the cocky sneer he had worn at the diner. Mike pulled his phone from his vest. He tapped the screen and held it up. It was the video Tyler had posted to their private group chat. The video of Brandon deliberately swamping Arthur's motorcycle, laughing as the caramel coffee shattered against the vintage gas tank. The bikers had their own network. Teenagers who wanted to brag on the internet were incredibly easy to track. "I don't think I do," Mike said, stepping into Brandon's personal space. The teenager was tall, but Mike was a mountain, casting a heavy shadow over him. "You know, Brandon, you drive a $70,000 truck you didn't earn. You wear clothes you didn't pay for, and you think that gives you the right to treat an old man like a piece of garbage." It was a joke," Brandon pleaded, his eyes darting wildly, looking for the principal, the police, anyone. "It was just a joke. I'll pay for a car wash. I have money." "You have your father's money," Mike corrected, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "But your father isn't here to buy you out of this one. In fact, why don't you call him? Call Richard." "What? Call your daddy," Bones growled from behind Mike, leaning forward and resting his massive tattooed forearms on the hood of the Raptor. "Tell him to come down to the school. Tell him you made a mistake." Trembling violently, Brandon pulled out his phone and dialed. Within 10 minutes, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class aggressively hopped the curb, bypassing the blocked entrance, and screeched to a halt on the grass near the flagpole. Richard Decker threw open his door. He was a man used to giving orders, dressed in a sharp, three-piece suit, his face purple with rage. He took one look at the sea of leather cuts surrounding his son's truck and immediately went on the offensive. "What the hell is going on here?" Richard bellowed, storming toward Mike. "Get away from my son. I'm calling the police. I will have every single one of you arrested for trespassing, harassment, and whatever else I can throw at you. Do you know who I am?" Mike didn't even blink. He just stared at the furious real estate developer. At that exact moment, the wail of police sirens pierced the air. 3 Bakersfield Police Department cruisers pulled into the loading zone, lights flashing. Richard Decker looked instantly relieved, a smug, arrogant smirk returning to his face. "You're done, bikers," Richard spat. "Chief Miller is a personal friend of mine. I fund his precinct's charity ball." Chief Miller, a stern man with gray temples, stepped out of his cruiser. He looked at the massive crowd of Hell's Angels, then at the trapped Raptor, then at Richard Decker. He didn't look panicked. He looked disappointed. "Chief, arrest these thugs," Richard demanded. Chief Miller calmly walked past Richard, completely ignoring him, and stopped in front of Iron Mike. To Richard's utter shock, the chief extended his hand. Mike shook it. "Morning, Mike," Chief Miller said casually. "Got a call about a disturbance. Then dispatch told me it was you boys. Also told me why." "Morning, Chief," Mike nodded. "Just giving a little civics lesson." "Chief Miller, what are you doing?" Richard screamed. "They are threatening my son." Chief Miller finally turned to the wealthy developer. "Shut your mouth, Richard." The chief snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. The sudden authority silenced the businessman. "You're idiot, son," Chief Miller continued, pointing a stiff finger at Brandon, "decided to assault and humiliate Arthur Pendleton. Arthur happens to be a decorated combat veteran. He also happens to be the man who spent 20 years single-handedly repairing and maintaining the motorcade for the Bakersfield Police Department at cost, saving this city hundreds of thousands of dollars. We respect him, and clearly, the chief gestured to the 200 silent bikers. The club respects him." Richard Decker paled. He looked at his son, the reality of the situation finally piercing his bubble of wealth. "Money doesn't buy you out of disrespect, Richard," Mike said softly. "But we aren't here for violence. We don't want your money, and we aren't going to hurt your boy." Mike turned to Slider. "Bring him up." The crowd of bikers parted like the Red Sea. Riding slowly up the center aisle, the deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the shovelhead engine echoing off the school walls, was Arthur Pendleton. He parked his mud-caked 1969 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide right next to the pristine white Ford Raptor. Arthur killed the engine and stepped off. He was dressed in clean jeans and a fresh flannel shirt, though he still moved with the quiet, rigid dignity of a soldier. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Richard Decker stared at the old man, completely speechless. Brandon looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Mike reached into his saddlebag and pulled out two items, a small plastic bucket filled with soapy water and a soft bristled toothbrush. He walked over and slammed them onto the hood of the Raptor. "You see, Brandon," Mike said, his voice carrying over the dead, silent courtyard. "A man's vehicle is a reflection of his soul. Arthur put 50 years of his life into this machine. You covered it in mud for a laugh. You disrespected his property, his peace, and his honor." Mike pointed to the bucket. "You aren't going to pay someone to fix this. You're going to clean it yourself, right here, right now, in front of your friends, your teachers, and your father. And you're going to use that toothbrush on the engine fins until Arthur says it's clean." Brandon looked at his father, desperately, silently begging for a bailout. Richard Decker looked at Chief Miller, who just crossed his arms. He looked at the 200 Hells Angels standing with stony, unyielding expressions. Finally, Richard looked at Arthur, the quiet, dignified veteran who stood beside his ruined motorcycle. In that moment, Richard realized that his son's arrogant behavior was a direct reflection of his own failed parenting. "Pick up the bucket, Brandon," Richard ordered, his voice hollow. Brandon choked back a sob of utter humiliation. He reached out with trembling hands, grabbed the soapy bucket and the toothbrush, and dropped to his knees on the hard asphalt beside the Harley-Davidson. For the next 2 hours, the entire school watched. Classes were delayed. No one moved. In agonizing, painstaking detail, Brandon Decker scrubbed the oily, gravel-filled mud out of the delicate cooling fins of the vintage engine. He scrubbed the caramel off the dented gas tank. His designer jacket was ruined, soaked in dirty, greasy water. His hands blistered. Through it all, Arthur simply stood there, watching quietly. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just observed. When Brandon finally finished, he dropped the toothbrush into the filthy black water. He stood up, his legs shaking, his clothes stained and smelling of oil. He looked at Arthur, tears of genuine shame cutting tracks through the grease on his face. "I'm sorry," Brandon whispered. It wasn't a rehearsed apology. It was the broken, genuine realization of a boy who had finally learned that actions carry weight. "I'm so sorry, sir." Arthur studied the boy's face for a long, heavy moment. He pulled a clean rag from his back pocket and tossed it to Brandon. "Wipe your face, son," Arthur said quietly. "And remember this feeling the next time you think you're bigger than the man standing next to you." Arthur turned, swung his leg over the gleaming, perfectly clean Harley, and fired up the shovelhead engine. Mike walked over, giving the old man a solemn nod before turning to his crew. "Mount up," Mike roared. The sound of 200 heavy engines firing simultaneously shook the very foundation of the high school. In perfect formation, the Hells Angels backed out of the parking lot, unboxing the Ford Raptor, and rode out onto the main street. They didn't cheer, and they didn't taunt. They simply escorted Arthur Pendleton back home, leaving Brandon Decker standing in the parking lot, forever changed by a masterclass in respect. Respect isn't bought with a platinum credit card. It's earned, and sometimes it's taught the hard way. If Arthur's quiet dignity and this incredible act of brotherhood from the Hells Angels gave you chills, you won't want to miss our next true story. Hit that like button to show your respect for the old guard. Share this video to remind people that actions have consequences, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life karma.